About the 1st of March, 1892, I was on my way from the 79 mine near Silver City, Owyhee County, Idaho to Boise City, Idaho, which is a distance of about 60 miles. I had heard there was about to be a sale made of the 79 mine and group of mining claims. I and 4 of the parties have a lease on the 79 mine and group of mining claims. I was going to Boise City to see H.R. Knott, the owner of the 79 mine. I wanted to see him about getting my pay for what work I'd done about the 79 mine. According to our contract with H.R. Knott, we took a 3-year lease on the 79 mine and group of mining claims with the understanding that if the property was sold before the expiration of our lease, that each of the leasers should be paid $4 a day and all expenses for what time he worked, and each leaser was to receive $1,000 besides. When I left the mine, I walked the Snake River the first day, a distance of about 30 miles, and stayed all night with a man by the name of Cox. The next morning, I left Cox's place to go to the hot springs. As I was passing Mr. Bernard's place, Mr. Bernard asked me if I had received a letter from Mr. Stearns of Nampa. I told him I had not. Mr. Bernard said Mr. Stearns would like to see me. I asked Mr. Bernard if he knew what Mr. Stearns would like to see me about. Mr. Bernard said that Mr. Stearns would like to employ the right kind of a man to run a cow outfit in Johnson County, Wyoming for a friend of his, and that they would pay me big wages. I told Mr. Bernard that I and some other parties had a 3-year lease on the 79 mine, and it had always, for the last 12 or 13 years, been considered one of the best mines in the state, and that while we were running the South Drift, that the lodge had lately widened out and showed higher grade rock than any other place in the mine. I told Mr. Bernard that I had heard that the mine was about to be sold, and if the sale came off, I would have money enough to go into something for myself, and if the sale did not come off, that I should go back to the mine and get out rock so that as soon as the roads got good, I could get the rock milled and get my money for it. Mr. Bernard said he heard we had a good layout on the mine, but that the man that wished to hire me and some of my friends to run his outfit of cattle was very wealthy and a member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, that the association had had a good deal of trouble with their stock in Johnson County, and that the Wyoming Stock Growers Association was the largest and wealthiest association of the kind in the world. And if I wanted to go to Wyoming to work, and if I and my friends would fit the bill, that money would cut no figure with the stock association. I thought the matter over a minute or two. I was satisfied there was something wrong. I told Mr. Bernard that I would think the matter over and have a talk with Mr. Stearns, that I could see Mr. Stearns in Nampa on my way to Boise City. I then went on to the Hot Spring Ranch. When I got to the Hot Spring Ranch, I told some of my friends that old Bernard was up to some more of his skull-dugging, that he had another scheme in view, that I did not take much stock in it, but I was a-going to see Mr. Stearns when I went through Nampa on my way to Boise City, and that I would learn more of the particulars. At this time, I was not acquainted with Mr. Stearns. This man Bernard that I had the conversation with in regard to coming to Johnson County, Wyoming to work was one of the leaders in the Stock Association in Owyhee County, Idaho 7 or 8 years ago. Everything in the line of the stock business in Owyhee County, Idaho seemed to be running smooth until the Stock Association was formed at Silver City, Idaho. There was at that time little or no complaint of stock stealing in that part of the country. About the time the Stock Association was in working order, there was rumors of cattle and horse stealing by the wholesale started around the country, and men who belonged to the association said if the small stockmen did not sell out or leave the country, that they would make them cost enough in court to break them up. When court set in the fall, the men who belonged to the Stock Association kept up their howl about the amount of stealing that was going on. The sheriff of the county had turned out defaulter to a large amount of money, and in order to cover up his defalcations, had committed a number of forgeries. The sheriff picked up the grand jury on the streets and managed to manipulate them in such a manner that the grand jury found 2 indictments against me for branding cattle and indicted a number of other parties besides myself. The amount of money the sheriff was defaulter was settled for him, and the courts failed to convict a man that was indicted by that grand jury. This man Bernard took a very active part in the prosecution of all cattle cases. I know him personally to be a thief and perjurer. He was continually talking about the need of a vigilance committee while the Stock Association was in its glory in Owyhee County, Idaho. The association only lasted about 2 years in Owyhee County, Idaho. It then went to wreck. In the course of a day or so after my conversation with Mr. Bernard in regard to my coming to Johnson County to work for a cattle outfit, I was in the street of Nampa, Idaho on my way to Boise City. Mr. Stearns called to me on the streets and asked me if it would be possible for me to go to Johnson County, Wyoming and take charge of a cattle outfit. Mr. Stearns said that it would be better if I could take 4 or 5 of my friends along, that everything would be fixed satisfactorily in regard to the money matter, that we would have a show to make some money. Mr. Stearns then went on to explain how he came to speak to me about the matter. He said he was back east on a visit last summer, and he met an old friend and school chum of his by the name of Clark. Said Clark was one of the best men he ever knew in his life, that Clark had made barrels of money out of the cattle business, and owned a large amount of cattle in Johnson County, Wyoming, and vicinity. Mr. Stearns then went on to tell me that Clark had told him while he was back east last summer that the cattle thieves or rustlers were committing great depredations on his stock in Johnson County, Wyoming, and that every man they hired was standing in with the rustlers, and that things would have to take a change in Johnson County, or the stockmen would have to gather up what stock they could and leave the country. Mr. Stearns said he had a talk with Mr. Clark about me and some of my friends, and told Clark that if he would give us good wages, that we would run his cattle for him, and that we would run them on the square, and that it would be a bold day if Clark did not get what cattle belonged to him. Mr. Stearns next showed me 3 or 4 telegrams that had been sent to him from Cheyenne, Wyoming, one of which read, "Please send party by next train if possible." When I saw telegrams, there was but little doubt in my mind but what the whole business was crooked. Mr. Stearns told me that money would be forwarded to me from Cheyenne, or else a man would come from Cheyenne to Napa and explain matters if I thought I could go to Johnson County, Wyoming. I told Mr. Stearns that I could go and to have his man, who Mr. Stearns told me would be H.B. Ijams, secretary of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, meet me in the course of 3 or 4 days in Nampa, Idaho. I told Mr. Stearns that I would be back from Boise City by that time. I then went to Boise City and came back to Nampa, Idaho, where I was introduced to Mr. H.B. Ijams of Cheyenne. Mr. Ijams and I then went over to Mr. Stearns' office to have a talk about the cattle business. Mr. Ijams talked very freely about matters pertaining to the cattle business in Wyoming, and especially in Johnson County. Mr. Ijams complained bitterly about the depredations he claimed that were committed upon the bands of horses and cattle by the rustlers in Johnson County and vicinity. He said that the Stock Growers Association would either have to put a stop to the thieves, or else sell out or gather up their stock and drive them to some other state. Mr. Ijams said the Stock Growers Association had owned stock on the range too long to be run out of the country by an outfit of thieves, and if it was necessary, the association would fight the thieves until the last one of them was wiped out of existence. Mr. Ijams said the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had paid out thousands of dollars for hiring men from different parts of the country to kill off the horse and cattle thieves in Wyoming. Mr. Ijams said the methods of the Stock Association were expensive, but he knew of no other way to keep the thieves down. Mr. Ijams spoke about the hanging of a man by the name of Wagoner, a horseman, and the lynching of Averill and Cattle Kate, and about the killing of Tisdale and Jones last fall, and the assault on Nate Champion and his partner on Powder River last fall. Mr. Ijams said that last fall the Wyoming Stock Growers Association made a contract with certain parties to kill off 15 men who were considered by the Stock Association to be the leaders among stock thieves in Johnson County, Wyoming. Mr. Ijams gave me to understand that the men who were employed by the WSGA to do the killing last fall in Johnson County, Wyoming, were Frank Canton and Joe Elliott and Tom Smith and another man whose name I forget, who Ijams said got off all right to Montana. Mr. Ijams said, "Our men got Tisdale and Jones all right. The next job they tried after they attempted to do up Champion and his partner on Powder River. They went into the Champion cabin about daylight and told Champion and his partner to give up, and at the same time one of the party fired his pistol at Champion's head. Champion then shot one of the party up the coat sleeve with his revolver and another through the ribs. The party then left Champion's place, leaving their grub blankets and several horses and overcoats in the vicinity of Champion's place. Mr. Ijams said that the failure of their men to do up Champion and his partner on Powder River put an end to the killing business for the rest of the winter in Johnson County. Mr. Ijams said that after the assault on Champion and his partner and the killing of Tisdale and Jones last fall on Powder River, there was a good deal of excitement in Johnson County, and people were getting on the warpath. That the Stock Association thought that if they had some of the thieves killed off, that it would terrorize the balance in such a manner that the most of them would leave the country. Mr. Ijams said the Stock Association were mistaken in regard to the effect produced by the killing off of a few thieves by men who were hired by the Stock Association. That instead of terrorizing the rascals, that the thieves were becoming more bold in committing their depredations upon livestock, and that the thieves were getting more on the warpath every day of their rascally lives. Mr. Ijams said that the course the Stock Association had been pursuing for a number of years in regarding to killing off the thieves in Johnson County and vicinity had bitterly prejudiced a great many ranchers and businessmen and other people who never owned any stock against the Stock Association, that he had thought the matter over a great deal, and had lately come to the conclusion that the Stock Association had not gone about the killing off of the thieves in the right manner. Mr. Ijams said that since the assault on Champion and his partner on Powder River and the killing of Jones and Tisdale last fall, that the Stock Association had another scheme in view for doing up the thieves, and he thought that it was the proper one under the circumstances, and that this last scheme would meet the approbation of a great many law-abiding citizens in Johnson County who would shudder at the idea of the Stock Association hiring men in Cheyenne or Texas to come to Johnson County to shoot the cattle thieves in the back. Mr. Ijams said that the latest scheme of Stock Association was to publicly wipe thieves in Johnson County, Wyoming, out of existence, the way he said the Stock Association in Montana did in that state 8 or 9 years ago. Mr. Ijams said that after the assault on Champion and the killing of Jones and Tisdale, that one of the Stock Association best men, a man by the name of Tom Smith, had gone to Texas to get 25 men to join the rest of the outfit in Cheyenne whenever the Stock Association saw fit to make a raid on Johnson County and kill off the thieves. Said Smith used to be a deputy U.S. Marshal in Texas, and that a number of deputy U.S. Marshals would come from Texas with Smith. Ijams said Smith had been engaged in the business of killing off cattle thieves for a number of years, and was the most successful man he knew of in his line of business. Ijams said Smith was the man who put up the job to hang a horseman by the name of Wagoner. Ijams said Smith and party read a bogus warrant to Wagoner and took him a short distance from home and hung him. Mr. Ijams said the Stock Association were hiring the men that Smith would bring from Texas on the basis of $5 a day for each man hired, and all expenses would be paid by the Stock Association, and the association would pay each hired man $50 for every man that was killed or hung by the mob while on the raid. Ijams said that most of the work would be accomplished in a month, but he intended to divide the mob up after the first month's work and have 5 men in each squad and have them ride over the country for several months and kill the thieves wherever they run on them. Mr. Ijams said the mob would probably kill off about 30 men in Johnson County while on their raid, that the Stock Association wanted to kill off more, but a good many thieves would escape. After the mob got through with Johnson County, they were to visit other parts of the country. Mr. Ijams said the mob would have 3 or 4 months' work, and it might take them all summer when the mob got through with Wyoming. Ijams said the association had raids planned for other parts of the country. Ijams said the Stock Association had 25 or 30 friends in Buffalo and vicinity who would join the mob when they got in the vicinity of Buffalo. Said the friends of the Stock Association in Buffalo were very determined men, and that the mayor of the town, a man I believe by the name of Burritt, was at the head of their organization. Ijams said the governor, attorney general, and Judge Blake were back of this movement to wipe the thieves in Johnson County out of existence. Ijams told me about the U.S. Marshal helping him plan the raid, and said that the Stock Association had some very warm friends in Congress and the U.S. Senate, among whom he said was Senator Kerry, a man of great influence and wealth. Ijams spoke about the sheriff and his deputies in Johnson County, and said they were in sympathy with the cattle thieves, and that he would rather have the sheriff and one of his deputies, a man I believe by the name of Rowles, hung than any 2 sons of bitches he knew of. Ijams spoke of Rowles as the affidavit fiend, said Rowles had caused the Stock Association a good deal of trouble by getting out affidavits against some of the parties the Stock Association had employed to kill off the cattle thieves in Johnson County. Mr. Ijams said the Stock Association had a great many influential friends all over Wyoming. He said the association paid no attention to the courts in Johnson County, that all the courts are on their side. He spoke about Frank Canton being arrested for killing Jones and Tisdale, said the evidence was very strong against Canton, but that Canton's friends were obliged to prove an alibi for him, said the affidavits in regard to Canton's proving an alibi had been got up to fit the case, and were false as far as the truth of the matter was concerned, that it was no trouble for the Stock Association to procure affidavits to fit any case. Ijams said if the raid came off, that it would come off before the cattle roundup. He said that when about 30 of the thieves were killed off, that 300 or 400 people who were in sympathy with the thieves would get up and leave the country the best way they could. That the people who were in sympathy with the thieves would leave their stock on the range, that before the raid was over, the Stock Association would have a roundup of the cattle in Johnson County and take possession of all the cattle on the range that belonged to the cattle thieves and their sympathizers. That the Stock Association would ship the beef and brand over the balance of the rustlers' cattle. Ijams said that if I and my friends were willing to work with the mob on the same terms that the Stock Association were hiring the rest of the mob in Texas, that the Stock Association would be glad to have us join the mob in Cheyenne at some future time. I told Ijams that I thought his terms were very liberal. Ijams said there would be no trouble about any of the mob getting their money according to contract. I told Ijams that I was willing to take the Stock Association for my pay. Ijams said it had not been definitely settled yet just when the mob would leave Cheyenne or just what action the Stock Association would take about the matter. Ijams said it would be necessary for him to return immediately to Cheyenne and confer with 2 other men who were officers in the Stock Association, who with him had the management of affairs in regard to recruiting a mob of men to come to Johnson County, Wyoming, and kill off the cattle thieves. Ijams said his propositions to me were made as an agent of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and before the association knew just what they would do about the matter, that it would be necessary for the association to hold a meeting at their headquarters in Cheyenne. And before the mob could start from Cheyenne to Jackson County, Wyoming to kill off the cattle thieves, that it would be necessary at the Stock Association's meeting for every member of the association or his representative to endorse the general plan of campaign of Ijams and the other 2 officers of the association who were connected with the recruiting of the mob to come to Johnson County, Wyoming for the purpose of killing off the cattle thieves and rustlers. Mr. Ijams said he would write me a letter once in a while after he got back to Cheyenne and keep me posted in regard to affairs. I then left Ijams in Nampa and went to Caldwell, 9 miles west of Nampa. This interview I had with Ijams in Nampa, Idaho was on the 7th of March, 1892. Before I left Ijams in Nampa, I asked him what was the general reputation of the cattle thieves and rustlers in Johnson County in the neighborhood where they lived. Ijams said the thieves the Stock Association intended to have killed off generally bore a good reputation in Johnson County and vicinity where they lived. Ijams said they were not generally considered thieves or outlaws in Johnson County and vicinity. After my arrival in Caldwell, I did not know hardly in how to regard Ijams' propositions. Ijams was perfectly sober at the time of our interview and seemed to be a very intelligent kind of a man. I saw Ijams talking in Nampa to one of the head men of the Ada County Stock Association, a man by the name Valentine. I thought the matter over a good deal. Ijams did not seem to get mad or excited during our conversation in Nampa, but seemed to talk about the matter of murdering 30 or more men in much the same manner that many people would talk about taking a picnic excursion. I could not think for some time that Ijams was in earnest. He seemed to have other business in the country besides interviewing me. Ijams asked me if I knew a man by the name of Lamb in Silver City, Idaho, that used to be editor of the Silver City Avalanche, and wanted to know if Lamb was in Silver City or vicinity. I told him that Lamb was in Delmar, Idaho, about 9 miles from Silver City. Ijams said that he had once loaned Lamb $1,500 in St. Louis, and that Lamb had never returned the money. Ijams said he had a notion to go to Silver City and see Lamb. Ijams inquired about Lamb's ability to pay the $1,500 and gave up the trip. I was satisfied that Ijams and some of those fellows in Nampa were trying to give me a talk on the side to see if I would not have Ijams arrested in Nampa, Idaho, or make a fool out of myself in some other way. Ijams, while in Nampa, had shown me a list of the men he wanted killed in Johnson County, Wyoming. Ijams spoke about 3 of the Ninemeyer brothers who had killed 3 men at Silver Mountain, Idaho, and said they had been recommended to him as the right kind of men for his business. The governor of Idaho had offered $1,500 each for the capture of the Ninemeyer brothers that murdered the 3 men in Silver Mountain, Idaho. When I was in Caldwell waiting to get paid for my work about the 79 mine, I thought over Ijams' propositions a good deal. I could not conceive how anyone had any reason to think that I and my friend were so diabolically inclined as to join a mob and go to a distant part of the country and engage in the business of murdering men by the wholesale who stood in the same position before the Wyoming Stock Growers Association that I and my friends a few years ago did to the Owyhee County Stock Association in Idaho. I and my friends in Idaho are about the only ones that ever had any trouble with the Stock Association in Owyhee County, Idaho. The Stock Association dealt us a good deal of aggravation for nearly 2 years, a large amount of which was blackmail, and some of the wretches had not quit their lying the last I heard from them. While the Stock Association was in existence in Owyhee County, Idaho, I took every active part in dealing the institution misery. I and my friends took a very active part in prosecuting and trying to bring to justice some of the perjurers and assassins whom we claimed were in the employ of the Stock Association. I have gone to a good deal of trouble and expense in Idaho to work a hardship upon that misguided and unfortunate institution of a stock association during its short and melancholy existence in Owyhee County, Idaho. The more I thought of Ijams' propositions, the more I became convinced that Ijams had been imposing on me with his stories in regard to killing off the cattle thieves in Johnson County, Wyoming. When the members of the Owyhee County Stock Association in Idaho were talking unusually wicked and seemed to be a-thirstin' for gore, I and some of my friends formed an association for the purpose of bringing to justice any of the members of the Stock Association who should do a small stockman an injustice. And we intended to bring to justice any criminals that might be in the employ of the Stock Association, and we were quite successful in running down some of the criminal in the employ of the Stock Association. Our association was an organization for the mutual protection of the small stockmen. We were to brand each other's stock when convenient and favor each other in other ways. Our association, I have every reason to believe, is in as good running order today as it ever was. We call it the Owyhee and Bruno Stock Association. Soon after my interview with Ijams in Nampa, Idaho, I saw a friend of mine in Caldwell by the name of Henry Dement, who was a member of our association for running down vigilantes or criminal in the employ of the Stock Association of Owyhee County, Idaho. I spoke to Dement about the propositions that Ijams had made to me in Nampa. Dement said it would be a good idea for me to keep my eyes open, that the Stock Association was strong in Wyoming, and it was hard telling what they would do in that country. After I saw Dement, I thought the matter over a good deal, and came to the conclusion that as far as Ijams' propositions to me were concerned, that the whole business was a fake. I could not conceive how Ijams could imagine that I and my friends were composed of the right material for a mob. I could not think of any circumstance that any of us had ever been accused of that would justify Ijams in arriving at his conclusions. After a couple weeks, I got 2 letters saying he would keep me informed when he wanted me and party to start for Cheyenne, and he would let me know the number of men to bring with me. When I had my first interview with Ijams, I knew nothing about any of the troubles in Johnson County, Wyoming. After I got my second letter from Ijams, I began to pay attention to his stories. After I got my second letter from Ijams, I went to Boise City to see about getting my pay for my work about the 79 mine. On my way to Boise City and in Boise City, I met several men who had lately come from Johnson County or vicinity. I inquired about the state of affairs in Johnson County in regard to the cattle business. One of these men I had a talk with was Bob Gunnell, a noted foot racer and bartender at the Wilson Hotel in Nampa, Idaho. Gunnell said he was just from Johnson County and vicinity, came from there about 6 months ago. Gunnell told me about the killing of Jones in Tisdale and about the state of affairs generally in Johnson County, Wyoming. Gunnell was very bitter against the Wyoming Stock Growers Association and said the association had spent thousands of dollars for the purpose of hiring professional assassins in Texas and other places to come to Johnson County, Wyoming and vicinity and shooting law-abiding people in the back. Gunnell said the people of Johnson County were wild with excitement on account of the murders that had been committed upon peaceable and law-abiding citizens in Johnson County by assassins in the employ of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Gunnell spoke well of the people of Johnson County and vicinity, said that as a rule they were as law-abiding a class of people as could be found anywhere, that he believed there was less stock stealing going on in Johnson County than there was in most any county anywhere where there was as much stock as there was in Johnson County. I asked Gunnell if he did not think the Stock Association would attempt at some time to hang up some of the people of Johnson County, the way the Stock Association in Montana hung up the so-called thieves in that state 8 or 9 years ago. Gunnell said it would be just as good a thing as the people of Johnson County would want for the Stock Association to turn a mob loose in Johnson County, that a mob of 2,000 men could not intimidate the people of Johnson County. The other men I saw and had conversations with seemed to have about the same idea about matters in Johnson County, Wyoming that Gunnell did. They all spoke of the people as a law-abiding class of people, and all agreed that the Wyoming Stock Growers Association of Cheyenne had been importing assassins from Texas and other places to Wyoming for the purpose of shooting people from ambush whom the Stock Association styled rustlers or cattle thieves. After I had my conversation with Gunnell and others in regard to the cattle business in Johnson County and vicinity, I began to think that Ijams might have been in earnest to a certain extent in regard to his propositions to me. I was convinced of the utter hopelessness and foolishness for the Stock Association to ever send a mob to Johnson County. If Ijams meant anything by his propositions to me, I supposed he meant to recruit an outfit of men and have them go to work in Johnson County in his cow outfit, and then see after he was well acquainted with the men how many men he could select out of the outfit that were of the same stripe that Frank Canton had been represented to me to be. I began to think Ijams was in earnest. I stayed in Boise City several days and tried to get my pay for my work in the 79 mine, and I tried to get money from other sources and spoke to some of my friends, Henry Dement and Frank Spielman, about wrestling money for one of them to come to Johnson County, Wyoming, and let certain parties know about Ijams' propositions to me. I could not get the money to send a man ahead in time to inform the authorities in regard to Ijams' propositions to me. It did not used to be any trouble for me to borrow a few $100s in Idaho. I most always had money when I was engaged in the cattle business. But during the last few years that I have been mining and doing other work, I have gone broke on pretty near every project that I have tackled. I had $1,484 coming to me for my work about the 79 mine. I have not got any of the money yet. I soaked my revolver in Caldwell in a pawn shop to get money to go to Boise City on and try to rustle money in order to send a man ahead to let certain parties in Johnson County know what propositions Ijams had been making to me. I never got my 6-shooter out of soak until Ijams sent me the money to come to Cheyenne. I left the letters that Ijams sent me with Henry Dement of Caldwell, Idaho. I talked the whole matter over with Dement and others, so that if the mob came into Johnson County or were captured on the way, that they could not make any bull stories stick in regard to their coming to Johnson County with peaceable intentions. Ijams always represented to me that the first thing the stock association had to do was to kill off the rustlers, and then the stock association would have a roundup of the cattle in Johnson County before the mob left the county, and that the stock association would appropriate all of the rustlers' cattle and horses, and all stock that belonged to the sympathizers of the rustlers. Before I left Idaho, I tried to get Bob Gunnell to come to Cheyenne with me. I was satisfied from what I heard that Gunnell was well acquainted in Cheyenne and had relations living there who were well fixed and could let Gunnell have the money to come ahead and inform the authorities in Johnson County in case we had reason to believe that the outfit that was to leave Cheyenne was a mob and were coming to Johnson County with the intention of killing off the rustlers. I told Gunnell that I was confident that we could capture enough of the criminals in Cheyenne to pay us handsomely on account of certain parties I expected would be in Cheyenne with the mob about the time we got there that had large rewards offered for their capture. Gunnell said he would like to come, but I would make it all right anyway, and that he was badly in debt in Nampa and could not leave the country until he squared up, that he had to go to Delamar right away and run a foot race, that it would be $1,200 or $1,500 in his pocket to run the race. I arrived in Cheyenne April 2nd, 1892. I came in on the 5 o'clock afternoon train. I was in town 5 or 10 minutes when I met Ijams on the street. He said he was just looking around and was expecting to see me and party from Idaho. He asked me how many men I had brought along with me. I told him that I was obliged to come alone this trip, as I and my friends were expecting a good deal of trouble in my part of the country, and it would be necessary for every one of my friends to get to the front if matters took the turn that we expected they would. He said that we would get along nicely anyway, that Smith had no trouble in getting the number of men in Texas that he wanted at the rates the Stock Growers Association offered, $5 a day wages and all expenses paid by the Stock Growers Association, and $50 bounty to be paid to each hired man for every man that was killed in the raid made by the mob in Johnson County or vicinity, and that the terms were the same as we had talked about at Nampa. Ijams asked me if the terms on which the Stock Growers Association had hired the men in Texas were satisfactory to me. I told him I thought the terms of the Stock Growers Association were very liberal. He said if I chose to remain in the country after the raid, that the Stock Growers Association would be able to offer other inducements to me. Ijams asked me if I brought my bedding and saddle or my guns. I told him that I brought nothing with me but my revolver. He said that he would go around town with me tomorrow and show me the stores where the Stock Growers Association generally did their trading, and he would make arrangements for me to get anything I needed in my line and have it charged to the Stock Growers Association. Ijams said we would have plenty of time, that we could not start as soon as he thought we would when he sent me the letter to Caldwell. Ijams said the Stock Growers Association had not held their meeting yet, and that the men from Texas would not come from Denver until the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had held their meeting. Ijams said the coming meeting of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association would be the most important meeting of the kind ever held in this western country. Ijams said it would be necessary for every member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association to be present at the next meeting or to be represented by a proxy, and that it would be necessary for every one of them member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association or his proxy at the next meeting to endorse the general plan of campaign of Ijams and 2 other officers of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association who had charge of the arrangements for recruiting a mob of men for the purpose of coming to Johnson County, Wyoming, and killing off the rustlers. Ijams then asked me if I had found a hotel that suited me. He said I could stop at the Inner Ocean or the Metropolitan and that the Stock Growers Association would settle my bill. He said that there were a number of stockmen who were going on the raid to pilot the mob through the country, stopping at those 2 hotels. I told Ijams that I had on my working clothes and I would rather stop at some cheaper hotel. He said, all right, to suit myself, to knock around town and enjoy myself the best I knew how, and if I wanted a suit of clothes or money, I could have them, and that I would want to get me a good rig, that I was now working for a rich firm, and that at the figures I would get for my work, that it would not take me long to pay for a good outfit, and that one average killing for the mob would pay for a first-class rig and probably more. Ijams and I then parted. I went over to the Dwyer House, a 25-cent hotel, and registered my name. After supper, I sent a letter directed to Sheriff, Buffalo, Johnson County, Wyoming. In letter, I stated that a mob would leave Cheyenne for Buffalo in a few days for the purpose of killing off the rustlers. After supper, about 8 o'clock in the evening, I met Ijams and 2 other men on the streets. Ijams introduced the 2 men to me as Mr. Morrison and Mr. Tabor. He said Morrison and Tabor would show me around the town. I had a long conversation with Morrison and Tabor that evening. They said they had been in the employ of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association for a number of years as stock detectives. They said they had worked for the Stock Growers Association so long that the association thought they owned them. They said they were going along with the rest of the mob when they left Cheyenne to go to Johnson County to kill off the rustlers. They said the mob would first come to Buffalo and kill off what men they wanted in town, that they would shoot or hang up the sheriff and his deputies, and would depose the civil authorities and keep possession of the town until the Stock Growers Association could have their own officers to take charge of the courts of Johnson County. They said the mob would have to do a good deal of fighting in Johnson County, but when the mob cleaned up Johnson County, that it would raid Natrona, Sheridan, and Converse counties, and would meet with little opposition in those counties and in the Sweetwater country. That the rustlers outside of Johnson County were unprepared to make a fight, and were not expecting anything, and that all the mob would have to do would be to hang them up as they come to them. Morrison and Tabor said the mob would have its hands full in Johnson County. That last fall, the Wyoming stock growers had employed 4 men to kill off a number of the rustlers. That these 4 men made an assault on a man by the name of Champion and Gilbertson on Powder River. Said these 4 men intended to hang Champion and Gilbertson in their cabin. That they went into the cabin about daylight and told Champion and Gilbertson to give up, that they had got them this time. That while these 4 men were holding their revolvers on Champion and Gilbertson, the Champion got his revolver and shot one of the party up the coat sleeve and another through the short ribs. That the party then retreated, leaving their horses, overcoats, bedding, some grub, and a Winchester that Tom Smith had at one time made Frank Canton a present of. I understood Morrison to say that the parties to the assault on Champion and Gilbertson were Frank Canton, Joe Elliott, Tom Smith, and Fred Coates. They said that last fall, after the assault on Champion and Gilbertson, that there were 2 men killed near Buffalo by the name of Jones and Tisdale. They said that the party that killed Jones and Tisdale was in the employ of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. They said that Champion and others knew who these men were that were in the employ of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and that the mob would do all witnesses up that knew of any facts that would tend to criminate any of the parties who had been in the employ of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association for the purpose of killing off the rustlers. They said the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had offered these 4 men in their employ for the purpose of killing off the rustlers $1,500 bounty for each man killed. They asked me what arrangements I had made with Ijams in regard to my wages during the raid of the mob in Johnson County. I told them I had not made any definite arrangements yet, but that I would work the same as the rest of the mob. They said that the Stock Growers Association had told them that they were hiring the Texas men on the basis of $5 a day wages and all expenses paid by the association, and $50 bounty to be paid to each hired man of the outfit for every man that was killed by the mob. They said the Stock Growers Association told them they would give them the same rates, but if any of the mob were getting more, that they wanted the limit, that they did not want to work cheaper than the rest of the mob on account of their having been in the employ of the Stock Growers Association for a number of years. Tabor said he was in the Powder River country in Johnson County last fall. That the men who were in the employ of the Stock Growers Association for the purpose of killing off the rustlers had terrorized Johnson County to such an extent that everybody carried Winchesters and 6-shooters wherever they went, and that when the settlers were going to Buffalo, if they were horseback, that they hardly ever traveled the main roads, and that they always tried to ride around the gulches and bunches of brush. Tabor said the settlers seemed to think that the Stock Growers Association had a man hired to stand behind every bunch of bush or rock in the country for the purpose of taking their scalps for the bounty that was offered by the Stock Growers Association. Tabor said his business in Johnson County was looking out the country and keeping cases on the rustlers. They said that a liquor or dry goods drummer could not come into Buffalo without the settlers thinking that he was in the employ of the Stock Growers Association and had his valises loaded with dynamite for the purpose of blowing them up. This is the substance of my interview with Morrison and Tabor the first night I was in Cheyenne. On the morning of the 3rd of April, I met Ijams on the streets. I told him that I was looking around town to see about getting me a Winchester. He said he had just bought me one that morning, a .45-90 Browning Brothers patent. He said the outfit would get all their guns at one store and that the Stock Growers Association would foot the bill. I went over to the store to look at my gun. I saw a number of stockmen getting guns and ammunition, among whom were H.W. Davis, R. Tisdale, J.N. Tisdale, and others. The next day I got me a saddle and the rest of my rig, 1 pair of leather chaparros. The same day I got my gun, I saw a man in gun store, April 3rd, when I was looking at my gun. His name was Fred Wumbold. He said he used to scout for government with a man by name of Ketchum, brother of the man that was lynched by the Olive outfit in Nebraska. We had a long talk about mob law generally, and Wumbold said he had been watching things around the gun shop and that the stockmen had already bought over 20 guns there that day, and that they were organizing a mob to come to Johnson County to kill off the rustlers. I told Wumbold when the mob would leave Cheyenne. He gave me to understand that he would come ahead of the mob and inform the authorities in Johnson County. There was a good deal of excitement at the gun store where the mob got their guns. Ben Morrison and Tabor told me that the whole town was onto the racket of the mob going to Johnson County. They said that all the officials in Cheyenne were friends of the Stock Growers Association, and that we would not be molested on that account. I asked them if the soldiers were not liable to hold up the train when the mob got opposite Fort Russell. They said that Governor Barber had the running of the soldiers, and he would not allow them to molest the mob. That Barber helped plan the raid the mob was about to make, and that the officers at Fort Russell were friends of the stockmen. On the evening of the 3rd of April, I got acquainted with a man by the name of Mike Burns from Buffalo. We had a talk about the mob. He told me he would start for Buffalo on the morning train and would inform the authorities in regard to the mob. On the 4th day of April, I helped to brand the horses that the mob left Cheyenne with. There were 3 carloads of them. They were branded on the left shoulder. When we were branding horses, I was introduced to Joe Elliott, Van Tassel, Ewing, Clark, and others. When we were branding horses, there was a good deal of talk about the state of terror the settlers of Johnson County were in on account of the depredations that had been committed upon the settlers by Elliott, Canton, Tom Smith, and Fred Coates. They told about an old man that was not classed as a rustler and who they said they did not suppose ever stole anything in his life. They said the old man heard a noise outside of his house one night, and that the old man emptied his Winchester through the door, and when he looked out of the window in the morning, he saw his favorite saddle horse laying in front of the house dead. There was a good deal of talk about the necessity of killing off all men who were witnesses against Elliott, Canton, Smith, and Coates. These were the 4 men that it was claimed were in the employ of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association for the purpose of killing off the rustlers last fall. It seemed to be the general opinion among the gang at the stockyards that if the mob could kill off about 30 rustlers in Johnson County, that it would terrorize the settlers in such a manner that 300 or 400 settlers that owned stock and were in sympathy with the rustlers would leave the country the best way they could, and that the Stock Growers Association would have no trouble about appropriating their stock together with the stock of the rustlers the mob intended to kill off. On the 5th day of April, I helped to load the 3 wagons and the 3 carloads of horses and the baggage that belonged to the mob. A man by the name of Van Tassel bossed the job. I saw Ijams again on the afternoon of the 5th of April. He said the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had held their meeting. He said the Stock Growers Association had approved of the general plan of campaign of his. Ijams and the other 2 officers of the Stock Growers Association, who had charge of the arrangements for recruiting the mob and of the general plan of killing off the rustlers. He said the mob would get along nicely, that every man that was a member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association was backing up the movement, that Governor Barber, the Attorney General, Judge Blake, the U.S. Marshal, and nearly all the state officials were on the side of the Stock Growers Association and would stay with the mob through thick and thin. He said the mob had some very influential friends in Congress and in the U.S. Senate, among whom he said were Senator Carey and Warren, whom Ijams said were men of great influence and wealth. I asked Ijams if he thought the outfit might not be arrested at Fort Russell on the way to Casper. He said there was no danger, that Governor Barber and Senator Warren and Carey would manipulate the troops, that the troops could not be called out except for the protection of the mob, and that the mob would be able to take care of itself, and that the officers of the troops at Fort Russell were friends of the stockmen. I asked Ijams how about the troops at Buffalo. He said the troops at Buffalo were an outfit of sons of bitches, that they had been stealing beef from the stockmen for years, and that the officers at McKinney upheld them in committing their depredations, that the soldiers at McKinney would invest the amount they saved by not drawing beef rations and luxuries, and the way they were carrying on, Ijams said the soldiers at McKinney were able to eat plum duff 3 times a day. Ijams said that arrangements had been made to watch the soldiers very closely at McKinney and see that they did not desert or steal out a Gatling gun and join the rustlers. Ijams said that parties in Buffalo would look after the soldiers so closely at McKinney that they would be perfectly harmless as far as the mob was concerned. About 6 o'clock in the evening, the mob left on the train for Casper. Before leaving the stockyards, the mob in Cheyenne were joined by the mob of Texans that come on the train from Denver. I think there were about 52 men on the train when the mob left Cheyenne. There was no excitement on the train until after dark, when orders were given for every man to get a rope and to have his guns ready. The leaders of the mob said the sheriff from Buffalo and 1 or 2 of his deputies might be coming on the train from Casper to Cheyenne, that a good many people in Cheyenne had known for some time the mob would start for Johnson County, and that the people in Buffalo might have heard about the mob, and the sheriff and 1 or 2 deputies might be coming to Cheyenne to see what they could find out. The leaders of the mob said arrangements had been made so the mob would know if the sheriff and party were on the train, and if they were, they said it would change the plans of the mob altogether. That it would be necessary for the mob to stop the train from Casper if the sheriff and party were on, and to hang the sheriff and his deputies and any rustlers that might be on the train. The leaders of the mob said there were several rustlers in Casper that they would hang up if they were obliged to capture the sheriff and party from Buffalo, but if sheriff and party were not on the train from Casper, that the mob would go direct to Buffalo without interfering with anyone. Before the train the mob was on met the train from Casper, the leaders of the mob reported that sheriff and party were not on the train from Casper. The train the mob was on arrived at the stockyards near Casper a short time before daylight and commenced to catch and saddle up their horses. By the time the part of the mob left the stockyards that had their horses in the last of the 3 cars of horses, the sun was about half or 3/4 of an hour high, and parties in Casper seemed to be watching the mob closely. Some of the mob said there were several rustlers in Casper from Johnson County that they ought to hang up, but they did not want to make any disturbance until they got to Buffalo. They said if the mob caused a disturbance in Casper, the sheriff in Buffalo would swear in 100 or 200 deputies and come to meet the mob in the Powder River country. The mob said the only way they could succeed was to come to Buffalo and kill off the sheriff and his deputies, so that the citizens would have no leader and no law in the country to protect them. The mob came about 6 or 7 miles north of Casper and stopped for the wagons to come up in order to get breakfast. The mob stopped in camp until about 1 o'clock. About noon, several of the mob went out and brought in a horseman. The mob said they intended to kill all rustlers that they would capture on the roads. They held the horseman prisoner for about an hour. He was unarmed and proved to be a man that was riding after sheep. The mob took him along prisoner for 6 or 7 miles north of where they camped at noon, and turned him loose after making him promise to say nothing about seeing the mob in the country. The first night out from Casper, the night of the 6th of April, the mob camped about 20 miles north of Casper. On the morning of the 7th of April, the mob were called together and told that hereafter the Texas part of the mob would be in command of Tom Smith, and the rest of the mob would be in command of Frank Canton, for the mob to obey orders and ask no questions. About 10 o'clock on the morning of the 7th of April, the mob stopped a young man from Buffalo by the name of Kingsbury. They said he was a sheepman's son. He was allowed to go his way. About noon on the 7th of April, the mob camped about 30 miles north of Casper and got dinner. From there they left the wagons and arrived at John Tisdale's on the night of the 7th of April. Mob arrived at ranch about 8 o'clock in the evening. The weather was very stormy. About 10 or 12 miles before the mob got to Tisdale's ranch, they were met by Mike Shaughnessy, who informed the mob that at a ranch on Powder River there was 15 or 16 rustlers. I could not get any information at the time, just what ranch it was the rustlers were at, or in just what part of the country the ranch was, but I have since learned that the ranch that Shaughnessy meant was the KC Ranch on the Middle Fork of Powder River. The Texas part of the mob stopped in the bunkhouse at Tisdale's ranch. The stockmen stopped up at the residence. I was with the Texas party at the bunkhouse. On the morning of the 8th of April, we were told by the leaders of the mob that we would lay over at Tisdale's place that way and wait for the wagons to come up and the men would have a chance to rest. The Texas men were about played out. In the afternoon, we were told that the leaders of the mob had decided to make a raid on the rustlers on Powder River about 16 miles from Tisdale's ranch. The leaders of the mob in the evening gave orders for the mob to kill every man on this ranch they proposed to raid, and to leave no man alive about the ranch to tell any tales afterwards, no matter who he might be. The wagons arrived at Tisdale's ranch about 5 o'clock in the evening of the 8th of April. After the wagons arrived at Tisdale's ranch, the mob were told by the leaders that would be the last place we would probably see the wagons unless by an accident the teamsters were able to deceive the rustlers and get through to Buffalo. That for every man to get what ammunition and blankets he wanted to take along with him. That after the mob raided the ranch on Powder River, the country would be full of straggling rustlers, and the chances were they would capture the wagons. About 7 o'clock in the evening, 4 men were detailed to go to the ranch on Powder River and keep off a safe distance and see if the parties who lived at the ranch had left or not. I managed to get one of the Texans who was detailed for the occasion to let me go in his place. I had caught my horse and started to saddle up when Woolcut came down from the house and said I could not go along with party to investigate matters. He said the men that were detailed for the occasion would have to go, and that us fellows would have to learn to obey orders better and ask less questions. If I had gone along with the party of 4 to investigate matters at the KC Ranch, I intended when we got in sight of the KC Ranch to get off my horse and empty my Winchester at the rest of the gang, and then to go down to the house and inform the parties who were living there as to the state of affairs in their parts of the country. Mike Shaughnessy, Jack Jones, Dick Kinsey, and Booker left Tisdale's Ranch to investigate matters at KC Ranch on Middle Fork of Powder River. They were to meet the balance of the mob 4 miles south of KC Ranch after they had investigated matters and let the rest of the mob know how everything was running about the ranch. The mob left Tisdale's Ranch about 11 o'clock on the night of the 8th of April and stopped several hours in a gulch on the road about 4 miles from KC Ranch and waited for the return of Shaughnessy and party. I was watching closely while the mob were in the gulch for an opportunity to give them the slip, but everyone was closely watched and I did not stand any show to get away. The day the mob were on the march to Tisdale's Ranch, a man whom I afterwards learned was Scott Davis asked me if I was not from Owyhee County, Idaho. I told him I was. He said he used to buy horses in my part of the country and that he still owned a house and lot in Caldwell, Idaho, and several lots he had bought for speculation. As soon as he spoke about his being in Idaho, I recognized as a man I had seen in Caldwell different times. From the time Davis informed me that he had lived in Caldwell, the leaders of the mob enforced very strict discipline. If one man of the outfit should stop for not over a minute or two, the balance of the mob would stop with him. From the time Davis spoke to me about Idaho, my privileges were considerably curtailed. Shaughnessy and party finally returned to the gulch where the balance of the mob were waiting and reported everything all right at the KC Ranch. They said the parties there were not expecting anything and that they were playing the fiddle and having a good time generally. Shortly after the return of Shaughnessy and party, the mob started for the KC Ranch. Joe Elliott had about 10 pounds of giant powder tied up in a gunny sack and tied behind his saddle. It was the intention of the mob to blow the house at the KC Ranch up with the giant powder and to shoot any of the men who showed up in sight at the KC house after the explosion. But the mob got to the KC Ranch too late to use the powder. It was breaking day when we got in sight of the KC Ranch. About the time the mob saw the KC house, the leaders of the mob, Major Wolcott, Frank Canton, and Tom Smith, called to the mob to halt, pointed out the KC house, and said the parties they proposed to kill off were living there, and that they did not intend to allow any man that was about the place to get away alive. They said the mob were too late to use the giant powder, that they would have to surround the house and let the parties at the house come out as far as possible, and then they would shoot them down. The leaders then ordered 6 men to go on the south side of the KC house and conceal themselves in the gulch in order to shoot any parties at the KC house that might show up in sight. The 6 men ordered to take a position in the gulch south of the KC house were Mike Shaughnessy, Jack Jones, Dick Kinsey, and 3 of the Bookers. The balance of the mob went to the river and left their horses in charge of the part of the mob at the river about half-mile above the KC house. A part of the balance of the mob went down the river from where they left the horses, and hid behind the bank of the river for a distance of about 100 yards above the bridge, and the rest of the mob went to the stable, and some of them were concealed in stable, and some to the left of stable, and some of the mob were behind the end of stable, next to river, as shown on diagram. When daylight come, John Tisdale and I noticed a wagon in front of the KC house. Tisdale said that the party at the house had company. I told Tisdale that the visitors at the KC Ranch might be friends of the stockmen who were traveling through the country and were obliged to stop all night at the ranch. I told Tisdale that I did not hire out to kill men as I came to them, and I thought it would be a good idea if we found out who the strangers were at the KC house. Tisdale said he would like to find out who the parties were, but it would not be safe to go to the house. I told Tisdale that I would take chances on going to the house, that I would go afoot and tell the parties at the house that I came from Buffalo and was going to the railroad to leave the country. Tisdale said, all right, for me to go to the stable and tell the men at the stable about it. I went to the stable and told Canton and Wolcott that Tisdale was satisfied that the parties at the house were friends of his and that he told me to go to the house and investigate. Wolcott and Canton said that Tisdale must be crazy, that they would allow no man to go to the house, that if the parties at the house were friends of Tisdale's, that the chances were they would be out of luck. If I had gone to the house, I intended to inform the parties at the house about the mob, and I intended to stop in the house and not return to the mob. I was satisfied from what Joe Elliott and others had told me that the mob could never dislodge the parties in the house. I never had heard the mob say anything about running a wagon against a house to burn it down. But I was afterwards told that that plan was studied up in Cheyenne over a year before the mob started. After my talk with Wolcott and Canton about going to the KC house, I went back along the riverbank to where I had left Tisdale. Orders had been given by the leaders of the mob for every man of the mob to carry but 5 cartridges in his 6-shooter, and to have no loads in his Winchester. It was claimed at the time that Joe Elliott and party made the assault on Champion and Gilbertson on Powder River that the party were waiting in the brush for Champion and Gilbertson to come out of the house so they could shoot them, and that one of the party let his 6-shooter fall on the ground and that it went off and the party were obliged to make an assault on Champion and Gilbertson for fear they might have heard the gun and would get to thinking the matter over and would not come out of the house. The leaders said if any of the gang did not want their heads shot off, they had better not allow any guns to go off accidentally. The mob lay in ambush at least 2 hours before anyone showed up at the Casey house. Then one man came out and went back into the house again. In about 15 minutes afterward, an old man came out of the house with a water bucket in his hand and came straight towards the river. I kept showing up all that I thought was necessary when I saw the 1 and 2 men appear, but the old man kept coming right straight for the river. When he had got behind the bank of the river, Frank Canton, Joe Elliott, Ben Morrison, Tom Tabor, and Tom Smith and others took the old man prisoner and had one of the Texas kids guard him down and under the riverbank just below the bridge. In about half an hour after the capture of the old man, 2 men came out of the house and seemed to be on the lookout from their appearances. I thought they were aware there was something wrong. I kept dodging up so they could see me, and the largest man of the two went in the house in a rush. And the young fellow stood around a while and seemed to be watching in the direction of the river. I showed up again in sight. The bank was a poor protection where I was. The young fellow had just gone in the house, and I expected they would begin shooting from the house. I left my position and went up the river about 40 yards to where John Tisdale was at a cottonwood tree. The young fellow showed up again. He came out of the house and picked up a club and began whittling on it and coming towards the river. He seemed to be on the lookout all the time. It took him about half an hour to come from the house to stable. He was then taken prisoner by Canton, Elliott, and Party. Shortly before the young fellow got to the stable, the big man came out of the KC house. I showed up again and took a good look at him and asked Tisdale who he was. Tisdale said he did not know the man, that he was not wanted by the mob. The big man came out to where there was a big cottonwood tree and took an axe in one hand and began cutting the bark high up on the tree. Shortly after the arrest of the young man, the big man quit cutting the bark on the big tree and walked over near a smaller tree. He had been there for perhaps 10 minutes when there was a shot fired from an aperture in the stable that was used to throw out the manure. Almost at the same time the first shot was fired from stable, the men stationed at the north end of the barn commenced firing, and those men stationed in different localities fired. About the same time, the big man staggered and fell. The mob kept up a continual fire, and the big man began crawling on his hands and knees towards the door of the KC house. After the mob had fired perhaps 100 shots, there was a man appeared in the door of the house in plain view and began shooting towards the stable. He fired a number of shots and went out of sight in the house. He disappeared only for a moment and then came out in full view of the mob and began shooting again. During this time, the mob kept up a continual fire, and the big man that was shot near the house kept crawling towards the door of the KC house. By the time the big man got near the door of the KC house, the small man at the KC house had fired about 10 or 20 shots. The small man then put down his gun and pulled the big man in the house. The mob kept shooting at the house for the balance of the day, and there was a good many shots fired from the house. The mob claimed that the first man shot was Nate Champion. The mob kept the house surrounded and sent to a ranch to get a wagon and load of hay to run against the KC house to burn it down. But the men came back that had been sent after the wagon and reported that the wagon was away from home. About 3 o'clock, a man and a boy came along the road. The man was horseback, the boy was driving the team. The mob told them to throw up their hands and immediately began firing at them. They whipped up their horses, and after going a mile or so, they took a horse out of the harness. The boy mounted the horse, and the boy and man made their escape, closely followed by some of the mob who fired a good many shots at them. The mob captured the wagon and horse left behind by the boy and man. They brought the wagon down to the stable and loaded it with brush hay and wood and pitch pine. Major Woolcutt, A.B. Clark, John Tisdale, Tom Smith, and James Dudley then run the wagon against the KC house and set fire to the hay and shaving on the wagon. The house soon caught fire. There had not been a shot fired from the house for over an hour before the wagon was run against the house. The mob thought that both men in the house might be dead. In about half an hour after Woolcutt, Clark, Tisdale, Smith, and Dudley had run their wagon against the KC house and set fire to it, a man ran out of the south end of the house and continued running south. The mob at the stable and vicinity kept up a continual fire on the man that come out of the house and was running south. After the man from the KC house had run about 200 yards and was nearly opposite a part of the mob who were concealed in a gulch south of the KC house, the mob at the stable and vicinity quit firing, and the part of the mob who were concealed in the gulch south of the KC house raised up and began firing and killed the man that come out of the house at the KC ranch. The man that was killed in gulch south of the KC ranch, the leaders identified as Nate Champion. The mob said they were mistaken about the first man that was shot in the morning. They said that when they captured the teamsters Jones and Walker, that Jones and Walker told them that there were only 2 men at the house, Ray and Champion. The mob said the first man shot in the morning must have been Nick Ray. Tom Smith of the mob went through Champion's pockets and found a memorandum book with sketches of the fight at different times during the day. One of the mob took Champion's 6-shooter and belt after Champion's pockets had been rifled. Sam T. Clover, at the request of some of the mob, Tom Smith, Joe Elliott, and others, wrote upon a piece of paper, "Beware cattle thieves," and buttoned the piece of paper upon Champion's coat. Tom Smith, Elliott, and others of the mob said they wanted that piece of paper left on Champion's body so that when his friends found him, that they would know what he was killed for, and so that Champion's friends would know what to expect if they stopped any longer in the country. After the mob had killed Champion and Ray at the KC ranch, the mob took supper at the wagons about a half-mile above the KC house on the river. After supper, the mob started for Buffalo, about 6 or 7 miles from the KC ranch. The mob changed horses and kept on the road to Buffalo until near a place known as Carr's Ranch, where the mob saw a bright fire burning about half a mile ahead. Someone in the direction of the fire let a gun go off. The mob then left the road and turned to the left and cut a wire fence and went through a large field and come into the road again and followed the road to the 28 ranch, where the mob got some coffee and bread and took 2 hours rest in the loft of the stable. The mob then started for Buffalo on the morning of the 10th of April and came a short distance towards Buffalo from the TA ranch, when Ford, who had gone to the TA ranch to get a change of saddle horse for one of the mob by the name of Dudley, came riding up to where the mob had halted and reported that Dudley's horse had bucked with him and thrown Dudley, and that Dudley's Winchester fell out of the scabbard and was discharged about the time that Dudley fell from his horse and shot Dudley, breaking his leg. The mob claimed that arrangements had been made with parties in Buffalo to meet the mob a short distance from Buffalo and inform the mob as to the state of affairs in Buffalo. While the mob were talking about what to do with Dudley, a man rode it up to the mob. He came from the direction of Buffalo. This man informed the mob that there were over 200 settlers in Buffalo up in arms against the mob, and that the settlers were deputized as a sheriff's posse for the purpose of arresting the mob. This horseman informed the mob that the sheriff was in the Powder River country with a posse looking for the mob. This horseman from Buffalo said that the parties that had had charge of the arrangements for assassinating the sheriff at Buffalo had intended to kill the sheriff on the night of the 9th of April in order to keep the sheriff from organizing sheriff posses before the mob could get to Buffalo. But the horseman said that a man from Powder River had rode into Buffalo on the afternoon of the 9th of April and reported the fight at the KC Ranch, and horseman said that sheriff had organized a posse and started to Powder River before the parties who had intended to kill him off had an opportunity to do so. The mob then turned back and went to the TA Ranch and fortified. The mob claimed the reason they were fortifying at the TA Ranch was on account of their plans miscarrying in regard to the killing off of the sheriff on the night of the 9th of April. The mob intended to kill off the sheriff and his deputies if they first made a raid on Buffalo, but if the mob should get in a fight on the road to Buffalo, so that there was a chance for the people in Buffalo to hear about the mob being in the country before the mob had time to get to Buffalo. The mob claimed to have made arrangements with certain parties in Buffalo to assassinate the sheriff and his deputies in order to prevent them from swearing in a large posse of men for the purpose of arresting the mob. About 12 o'clock, a party of 15 or 20 men were seen by the mob a short distance from the TA Ranch going on the road towards Buffalo. The leaders of the mob said party were the sheriff and posse and gave orders for every man of the mob to conceal himself and to keep out of sight until sheriff and posse came up so close that the mob could see the white of their eyes from the stable. And then the leaders of the mob said for the mob to open fire on sheriff and posse and to kill every one of them. The leaders of the mob claimed that the sheriff and posse would come to the TA Ranch to demand the surrender of the mob, but sheriff's party kept the road towards Buffalo and did not come to the TA Ranch that day, April 10th, 1892. The leaders of the mob claimed that the mob was safer fortified at the TA Ranch than anywhere. They said the sheriff at Buffalo would deputize several hundred settlers for the purpose of arresting the mob, who would have taken no part in the fight if the sheriff and deputies had been killed on the night of the 9th of April, according to the arrangements made by the mob with certain parties in Buffalo. The leaders of the mob claimed that it would be impossible for sheriff's posse to capture the mob at TA Ranch inside of a week, and that before that time Governor Barber, Senator Carey, and Warren would manipulate the troops at McKinney in such a manner that the troops would come to the rescue of the mob before sheriff's party could do the mob any injury. The leaders of the mob were very bitter towards the soldiers at McKinney, and especially the commanding officer. The leaders of the mob said they knew the teamsters and wagons would be captured by the rustlers, and that they had fixed up a good scheme on the old beef-eating vagabond who was in command of the troops at McKinney. The leaders of the mob claimed they had told the teamsters to tell everybody that they had orders from the mob to drive the wagons to the post at McKinney and turn them over to the commanding officer at the post according to arrangements that the leaders of the mob had made with the commanding officer to take charge of the white cap wagons a week before. About 12 o'clock, 2 men came from Buffalo and joined the mob. One of these men was Phil Dufresne, and the other I understood was George Sutherland. These men brought considerable news from Buffalo to the mob. The mob claimed the cause of their being obliged to fortify at the TA Ranch was on account of the sheriff and deputies not having been killed on Buffalo on the night of the 9th of April according to arrangements. The mob claimed that if sheriff and deputies had been killed according to arrangements made by the leaders of the mob, that there would not have been any officers to serve in a posse of men as deputy sheriffs for the purpose of arresting the mob, and that the settlers would not have taken the responsibility upon themselves of turning out and fighting the mob. On the other hand, the mob claimed that if sheriff and deputies had been killed according to arrangements made by the leaders of the mob, that the friends of the mob would have joined the mob when the mob came to Buffalo, and that the expedition would have been a success instead of a possible failure. These matters were talked over by the mob, Dufresne, and the other man from Buffalo. The leaders of the mob explained to Dufresne and the other man from Buffalo that the mob would be obliged to fortify and remain at the TA Ranch until Governor Barber, Senator Carey, and Warren sent the troops at McKinney to the rescue of the mob. The leaders of the mob claimed that the mob could stand the sheriff's posse off for a week if necessary without losing any men, if the friends of the mob in Buffalo would closely watch the soldiers at McKinney and prevent the soldiers at McKinney from stealing out a Gatling gun and turning it over to the sheriff's posse, some of whom mob said were ex-soldiers and knew how to work a cannon. The leaders of mob told Dufresne and the other man from Buffalo that the morning of the 11th of April, the mob would send a man from TA Ranch to Cheyenne to confer with Governor Barber and the officers of the Stock Growers Association in regard to the predicament the mob was in, and for the purposes of making arrangements with the officers of the Stock Growers Association to have at least 150 men in readiness to reinforce the mob whenever the officers of the Stock Growers Association thought it would be expedient. The leaders of the mob explained at considerable length to Dufresne and the other man from Buffalo that there was yet a show for the mob to make a success of their raid if the friends of the mob in Buffalo would get to the front as they agreed to. The leaders of the mob told Dufresne and the other man from Buffalo that there was a show for the troops in McKinney to come out to the TA Ranch in the night to stop the fight. The leaders of the mob explained to Dufresne and the other man from Buffalo that if some of the friends of the mob could be concealed in a gulch by themselves near the lines of the rustlers and open fire upon the troops from McKinney, that the success of the raid made by the mob depended upon that one circumstance. The leaders of the mob said that their friends in Buffalo would have plenty of time to make their own arrangements in regard to selecting their ground, so there would be no trouble for them to get out of the way after they had fired on the soldiers and the fight had began between the soldiers and the rustlers. The leaders of the mob said that if the friends of the mob could bring on a fight between the soldiers and sheriff's posse in the night, that the mob would have their horses saddled for the occasion, and that as soon as the fight began between soldiers and sheriff's posse, that the mob would mount their horses and make their escape towards Cheyenne, where the mob would be joined by reinforcements and would come back and kill every man that had packed a gun against them at the TA Ranch. The man that came from Buffalo with Dufresne said he would go back to Buffalo and see what arrangements he could make to bring on a fight between the troops and sheriff's posse. He then left in afternoon for Buffalo. I asked Dufresne when he first heard the mob was coming to Johnson County. Dufresne said the first he knew for a certainty that the mob would raid Johnson County was last January, when he was in Cheyenne. I asked Dufresne if he had come from Buffalo to join the mob and stay with them. He said he had. Dufresne said that if the rustlers got a hold of me, all they would do would be to shoot me, but Dufresne said that if he fell in the rustlers' hands, they would burn him. On the afternoon of 10th of April, the mob built their fortifications in order to stand off sheriff's posse until Governor Barber, Senator Carey, and Warren could send the troops at McKinney to the rescue of the mob. The leaders of the mob claimed that if the mob attempted to retreat when their horses were so near played out, that they would be surrounded by sheriff's posse and would have to surrender to the civil authorities, something the mob said they did not propose to do under any circumstances. On the night of the 10th of April, one of the mob came to the TA Ranch about 10 o'clock in the evening. He said that he was riding in the head teamster's wagon and had his horse saddled and tied behind the wagon. He said that sheriff's posse passed the White Caps wagons on their road to KC Ranch. Said sheriff's posse asked the head teamster a few questions and then went on the road towards KC Ranch. He reported that after sheriff's posse left wagons, that he got on his horse and came on to join mob. He said the country was full of rustlers. About 3 o'clock in the morning of the 11th of April, I went from fort down to the house to get some grub for the men at the fort. At the house, I saw a man with his leggings and spurs on. I suppose he was the man that was going to Cheyenne. I asked J. Parker who he was, and Wolcott spoke up and said the man's name was Johnny Jones, that he was a distant relation of a great-grandaunt of his, and that I would better take a good look at him so I would know him the next time I saw him. After I had finished my breakfast at the house, I took some grub and coffee up to the men at the fort. About daylight, a number of horsemen appeared in sight of fortifications coming from the direction of Buffalo. The firing then commenced and was kept up most of the time until the surrender of the mob to the troops at Fort McKinney. During the fight at the TA Ranch, the mob seemed to feel perfectly secure from danger. They claimed that they were so strongly fortified that sheriff's posse would not charge the works, and that it would be impossible for the sheriff's posse to get their rifle pits close enough to harass the mob before Governor Barber, Senator Carey, and Warren would send troops at McKinney to the rescue of the mob. Then the mob claimed that if rustlers and troops did not get into a fight, that it would be necessary for mob to surrender to the military authorities and be taken to Fort Russell at Cheyenne, where the mob claimed they would soon be turned loose in a short time, and they would come back to Johnson County stronger than ever and would kill off every man that packed a gun against mob at the TA Ranch. The mob seemed to think the possible failure of the raid was due to the fact that the sheriff and deputies at Buffalo were not killed on the night of the 9th of April. During the fight at the TA Ranch, the mob talked a great deal about the way the men who were in the employ of the Stock Growers Association last summer and fall had terrorized the settlers. They claimed that last summer and fall that there was only 4 men in the employ of Stock Growers Association for the purpose of killing off the rustlers. The mob claimed these 4 men were Frank Canton, Tom Smith, Joe Elliott, and Fred Coates. Elliott and Canton had a good deal to say about how they would be back after the fight at the TA ranch. They said they would terrorize the settlers of Johnson County when they got back again, so that those settlers who had an opportunity to leave would get out of the country the best way they could. The troops from McKinney did not arrive quite as soon as the mob expected. The leaders of the mob thought that the commander of the troops was standing in with sheriff's posse and had taken the wrong road to the TA ranch. When the troops came in sight soon after sunrise, the whole mob appeared in fine spirits and said that their friends, Governor Barber, Senator Warren, and Carey, had sent the troops to their reserve, and that it would be but a short time when they would be turned loose, and then they would come back stronger than ever and would kill off every man that packed a gun against the mob at the TA ranch. George Dunning.